My name is Linda Pantel. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Programming here, and I am so excited to welcome you to this particular session, but all month long for Career Month. As a reminder, this session will be recorded. We will share that out. If you have any technical issues, we recommend shutting down programs that may be running in the background. But I am so excited to turn the conversation over to our panelists today. We have Senna joining us, we have Justin, and we have Alita, and I will let them introduce themselves, but I'm very excited for this conversation. Thank you for your time.
I can kick things off. Linda, thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Senna Agao. I am the Associate Director for Diversity Outreach at the Booth School of Business, specifically in the full-time MBA office. I've been in my role for about a year. However, previously to that, I was working in a similar role at UChicago grad, focusing on diversifying the master's and PhD programs across the university. I've been in DE&I work for about 3 years now, and I'm excited to have a conversation with my fellow panelists today.
My name is Alita Miranda Wolf, and I'm the CEO of Ethos. We are a full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion transformation firm. We really are a structured equity firm. So our focus is helping people within organizations understand their relationships to power, use their power responsibly, and share their power across 4 practices: consulting, coaching, training, and what we call inclusive communications. I've been a practitioner in diversity, equity, and inclusion for about 7 years. 3 of those years I've been leading Ethos. Previously, I came to this work actually through venture capital, which is where I really cut my teeth in the space.
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Douglas, pronouns he, him. I'm a 3rd-year graduate student in the dual degree program with social work and public policy. I'm at SSA in Harris at UChicago, and I've worked with diversity and inclusion initiatives during my time here. I currently serve as the graduate assistant for the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs at the office at the Center for Identity and Inclusion. And I also served as the co-president of the Graduate Council and the diversity chair of Graduate Council.
Great, thank you. And to start us off, let's talk about some definitions. What is allyship? When we use that word, what are we talking about? And anyone can answer that.
I can start it off. I think being an ally really, for me, is about sort of how we sort of both create space and take up space. I think being an ally requires us to at times sort of step up to the plate and speak for voices that maybe do not have the opportunity or the space to sort of advocate for themselves. But then it also means recognizing privilege and understanding when we need to use our privilege to, as an ally, to create space for marginalized voices and allow those voices to be heard.
Just adding to that, I think one of the points that really resonated for me in Justin's definition is this element of knowing how to use your privilege, because ultimately the key to allyship is if you are an ally, you're part of the dominant group. So when we're talking about allies, anyone can be an ally depending on their social identities, but your identity holds power inherently. So I can be an ally as a white person, just like someone who is man identified on my team can be an ally to me as someone who identifies as a woman. The key to allyship, I think, in our current conversation is what does power look like for us? And how do we mobilize it and use it in order to lift up those who have been systemically disadvantaged and marginalized? One of the ways that I think about allyship is, you've probably heard this, we have to give people a voice. Everybody has a voice. It's whether we're listening. One of the main roles of an ally is to make sure that what is being said is getting delivered and heard. So I think that that's key. I also think the term ally is a little bit controversial right now because of the fact that it can feel very passive. ally is like, well, I'm your friend. I'm on your side. I'm standing on the sidelines and I am sharing positive vibes with you. And so what I'm seeing in my community is a shift away from the term ally in that context to advocate, which feels more active, or even abolitionist, which is very much about tackling the root cause of injustice and inequity. I think the term ally can be used as long as people understand that if they're going to take that term on, one, they have to be named an ally. So to name yourself an ally for another group without having that group say, I want you to be my ally, and this is the role to take, is something that I think happens that we need to be conscious of. And then if we're going to be allies, we have to remember it's easy for us to stop taking action when the outrage is over because it's not our existence when we're in the dominant group. So if you're going to take on the mantle of allyship and sort of stick to this definition, it's what's my long-term strategy for making sure that power is getting dispersed more evenly.
I don't have anything else to add. I feel like both of our, Justin and Alita, did a great job kind of outlining that definition.
That's great. Thank you. And Alita, you hit on something interesting about like, there are lots of these terms that we are using. We're talking about bias. We're talking about allyship, advocacy, abolitionism, and those meanings are shifting constantly. So I want to talk about a few other definitions that might come up in these conversations. These are words you might hear in trainings. These are words you might be hearing from your managers, from folks in your organization. I think some of these terms we talk about, we hear bias, implicit and explicit. I know, Alita, you do a lot of work around diversity, inclusion, and equity, and that there's a distinction between those. We're hearing non-racism versus anti-racism, intersectionality. I'd love to hear, what are some of those terms that you think should be elevated in the conversation, and how do you define those concepts? What should could our audience walk away with really understanding about these terms?
So I am happy to give some straight definitions, and then what I'd love to hear is how Senna and Justin define them, because even within our own community, we're not always using the language in the same way. So diversity is variety. Think about it in terms of an ecosystem. It's the composition of a given group, and it's an outcome. You can achieve diversity. It may change over time. It's something you can measure. Similarly, inclusion is also an outcome, and inclusion is the experience of a person in a group where they believe that they are welcomed and they are fully leveraged for all who they are. Equity is not an outcome, and this is one of the reasons it's so important. It's a process, and it's what leads from diversity to inclusion. I think of equity as a relationship between power and fairness. Equity understands that equal access is critical and that not everyone can leverage equal access because of the ways in which certain groups have been disadvantaged and others have not. So when we think about equity, it's important to understand that if we say pull yourself up by the bootstraps, equality is what says make sure everyone has boots on. Equity is what says make sure those boots fit. And I think the order of things matters with this term, because we have to start with equal access first when we're thinking about equity. Otherwise, it's easy for people to say, well, I'm going to determine based on my biases and assumptions what this group needs, and we end up with separate but equal. It's just often that equality is not enough. Those two are in conjunction, and they're both processes where you're constantly working towards them. Intersectionality is a term that was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a civil rights activist and attorney, who was defining the very precarious and unusual situation in the courts of Black women who were treated as Black or as women and not as both, that they were doubly marginalized and needed to be treated in accordance with that. Unfortunately, the term has been reappropriated to mean so many things, especially in the last 5 years, where a lot of people use intersectionality to say we all have a lot of identities and isn't that weird and different. It's about how many marginalized identities you carry and understanding that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives. So gender and race and color and when we think about ableism and ability and we think about education, all of these things are entangled with one another. And we talk about bias, implicit bias versus explicit bias comes up in terms of microaggressions, comes up in terms of larger harassment. I think the term that is important, at least in my work, is mind bugs. So we have evolved cognitively to a point where some of the tools that we have at our disposal don't make sense. And that's where bias comes into play. Mind bugs, where it's very fast for us to categorize and have an away response or a toward response, depending on how similar or different someone is to us. Bias is what happens when our brain is faster than we are and categorizes based on what we see as different or the same, as well as how we are socialized to be. So ultimately, bias harms those we are biased against, even if it's a positive bias, thinking about like model minority status, but it's ultimately assumptions that we make about a given group that are based in a selected pool of observations. And then I will not take up any more space, but I have strong feelings on non-racism versus anti-racism. I just wanted to lay at least some foundation with definitions to start.
Thank you for that, Alita. I think you did a great job kind of providing our audience with some definitions and definitely went into them in ways that I don't think I could have been able to. So thank you. But kind of drawing on what you said, specifically thinking about bias, it's something that kind of comes into play pretty heavily in the work that I do. So in my current role, I oversee outreach, recruitment strategies as it relates to diversifying the full-time MBA program, which is an interesting role, especially when you're thinking about working in the world of business, which has been historically a space that's been dominated by white men, and only recently has been, kind of making an effort to change that. And in some instances, it's a true desire for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in some instances, it's more of a reaction to social pressure because it now looks good, and people believe that this is something they have to do in order to appear progressive, we'll say. But thinking about implicit bias and explicit bias, specifically in the application review process, is a really interesting thing. I come into it with my own biases, right? The conscious biases that I have as a result of walking through life as a Black woman impacts how I view applications, how I read them. Similarly, my colleagues, people on my team are bringing their own biases to the table. And one thing that has been really a focus in my work, as well as in my office itself, has been how do we address those mind bugs that Alita was mentioning before? How do we strategize, and what steps do we implement to ensure that we are reviewing these applications from and it's impossible to achieve, but a truly what's the word I'm looking for? A space where we don't allow our biases to impact the decision that we ultimately make. And that's one of the reasons why in admissions, broadly speaking, there are multiple processes of reviews, so that multiple eyes, multiple lived experiences, multiple people have the chance to interrogate and make a decision, and in some instances kind of catch the biases that the person before them kind of brought to the stage. I'll let Justin chime in if you have anything to say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add, but I think what came to mind as both of you were speaking was we just went through kind of the hiring process for new program coordinators and for new GAs at the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. And I think what stuck out to me was like kind of throughout the process was this sort of how we were thinking about diversity and like how broad sort of a definition sort of that could apply to that. And I think additionally sort of thinking about like taking sort of like one step beyond just sort of like, are we sort of pulling or interviewing applicants that sort of are coming from diverse perspectives, but then really thinking critically about like how those diverse perspectives would inform the work that they're doing. And I feel like that really gets sort of like, I think there's this sort of idea of like maybe like performative diversity where it's like, oh, we're sort of meeting that pressure that you were talking about, Senna, like that pressure to sort of diversify our sorry about that, diversify our pool, but sort of taking it that step further where you're really looking at like sort of the impact and the approach that the additional diversity of your group what it will add. what sort of perspectives are you bringing in, and how will those perspectives impact the work?
And that's a great lead in, to this next topic. This we talked about, allyship as being substantial and about action and not just performative. And one of the ways and actions that is frequently brought up in diversity efforts is hiring. And all three of you spoke on that to some degree. What can you share with our audience here are your hiring best practices, things that people could take to their office, and ways to think through the hiring process about diversity?
I'm happy to kind of jump in. I think there are a couple things to kind of keep in mind when you are thinking about your hiring processes and working to make them more diverse. To kind of draw upon what Alita said earlier, diversity kind of takes place in many ways, right? There are a lot of ways to have a diverse space. And in my work specifically, that I will say in my work specifically, and I think for a lot of other folks, when you hear diversity, you think solely diversifying from a racial or ethnic background perspective. You don't necessarily think of diversity as an all-encompassing term, which can include intersectional identities. It can include diversity in terms of gender. It can include diversity in terms of sexual gender orientation, in terms of disabilities, in terms of lived experiences writ large. And so when you are in the process of crafting say a job posting or interviewing candidates for a position, I think it's really important to keep this in mind when you're thinking about diversifying your space. In what way am I hoping to address this hopefully perceived gap in diversity that you're looking to kind of focus on, and kind of further on that, what is this person bringing in terms of their identity as a whole person, not necessarily one component of which is their race, their gender, their orientation, right? All of these things, yes, are diversity and fall under that umbrella, but remember that the intersectionality, specifically in my case, right, as a Black woman, is very impactful in terms of how I walk through the world, how I'm going to relate to people in the workforce, how I'm going to make decisions, participate on a team, et cetera.
I'll jump in here a little bit because this is something we specialize in at Ethos. We work with technology companies, professional services firms, nonprofits, really what we call growing and growth stage companies, to minimize bias in the interviewing process, really to get at what Senna was saying before. There's no way to fully eliminate it. There are safeguards you can put into place to minimize it, and you can lead a much better process than the one you have today. So excuse me if I'm very tactical with this. It's a process that I would recommend. So the first step is role design. And when you put the role together, it's really critically important that you design for the role and not your imaginings of who is on your team today. And I apologize for my calendar suddenly, but what is it that you actually need? Look at the strategy of your business, look at what you actually need the work to be, and then write your job description as a roadmap. So what is this person going to do in the next 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months? Not responsibilities, not minimum qualifications. When you put those requirements in place, you're already limiting your pool. You're also not taking on the position of a candidate advocate, which is something you're going to need to do if you're communicating with marginalized communities where members of those communities have had bad experiences interviewing before. They want a very transparent and clear picture of the work they're going to do. And so when you design the role, you have to know what they're going to do. You have to be able to lay that out for them. And I encourage you to not just put your job description through a text reader, like a Textio hire, that's going to look for bias, to also reconceive of the role in terms of the core work. We know from extensive research, and Plum has done some of this, that the best indicator of whether someone will be a good match for a role is a project interview. That's typically blind. A resume is a 13% indicator of whether someone can do the job. Unstructured behavioral interviews, 19%. Structured behavioral interviews, more in the 30s, right? So you're starting to get to a place if you ask the same questions, if you design those questions, if they're in the appropriate order. the project interview is critical. So you have to make sure that every step of the way, you are giving them information and you're giving them an opportunity to show what they can actually do, because the university that they went to isn't actually going to be that much of an indication. And I know this is a UChicago webinar. With that said, the job is the job is the job. So design, starting from that step. The next part is to actually design your process, and you should have a full process that's completely designed before you ever post that job description and that your managers are trained on. So a few rules that I like to go by. The first is make your application as practical as possible. If you want to have them submit a resume, do so. No cover letters. Instead, ask a few pointed questions that don't take a whole lot of time to answer, and we'll get at whether they can complete that roadmap. And then from there, make sure that you are communicating to your candidates as much as possible. Do you have a statement on racial justice that goes in that email? Do you have a statement on how you're handling COVID-19, keeping employees safe, and creating security in the role, which a lot of people from marginalized groups are especially concerned about right now because they know that they're the most likely to be targeted by a layoff. So what are you putting in to the communications to candidates that let them know you're thinking about these issues ahead of time? Because I will tell you, in working with predominantly white organizations on DEI recruiting, the biggest issue is people of color, people who are coming from all of the genders, all of the abilities, don't apply because they think it's going to be a bad experience. And once they start to see the information that comes through, they recommend other people. And you start getting more applications. And I've seen this in my own company. I've seen this with companies we worked with. So a few steps that should be in that interviewing process. That communication is defined all the way through. 3 types of interviews. Your initial screen, that is a match. You say a lot about the role in the company, including the things that are not great and the things that are. And you also get a sense of what they can do. You should have peer interviews that are not evaluative on the actual performance of the individual so much as what they will add culturally. I don't like a situation where peers are evaluating how good someone who at their level coming into the role will be, oftentimes because it can create a weird power dynamic. Instead, getting a sense of how do they collaborate, how do they work on a team. And there should be one-on-ones in all of those. We know that panel interviews are going to negatively impact people from marginalized groups who are more likely to experience interview anxiety. When you do a panel interview, it will likely be your project interview where they're doing work that has actually been completed in your organization before, where you tell them what it is in advance, you give them a time box period, you give them the opportunity to present it to people they have already met before, and then you show them what you did so that you can again collaborate. From there, it is important that you are very communicative during the reference process and the offer process. I really believe that reference checks should be done differently. If we're thinking about DEI recruiting, we know that if you're getting references, they're going to give folks glowing recommendations. That's why they were listed as references. Use it as an opportunity to say something like, our organization is in total chaos and won't be stabilizing for 6 months. Will this person be happy here? As someone who really cares about them as their reference, do you think they will want to be in this organization? Ask them questions about what will help this person grow and thrive, and ask yourself honestly if you can provide those things. And then from there, make sure that your offer is, this is a big thing for us, is the best offer you can possibly make. We discourage negotiation, not because we don't want marginalized people to negotiate, it's because we know that they will do so at lesser rates. And then oftentimes when they do, there's more resistance. So we say, let people know from the very beginning how much you're going to pay. That should be in your first interview. It should be in your job description, and let them know that that's your max and why. That's a thing that our clients have a lot of resistance to. It makes a really big difference. I know for us, we saw our applicant pool become 67% Black when we became very transparent about everything that we were doing with one of our organizations. So that's another critical part of it. And then this process of DEI recruiting does not end when the offer is made. Do you build a 30, 60, 90 ahead of time? Do you send it to the person ahead of time? Do you build an onboarding team for them that's going to be made up of folks who can actually be go-tos for them and can be a support system? Because sink or swim is not an acceptable strategy. especially given the fact that sink or swim only works if you're able to quickly develop relationships within an organization. And generally speaking, if you are coming from a marginalized group, that's going to be harder, especially if you're an only. If you're the only of your group coming into an organization, that will not be something that just happens for you. So structure in place is very important. There are a lot of other steps to this that I could share. I think those are the most important.
That's super helpful. Thanks, Alita. I'm curious, Justin, as a current student and somebody who will be, going on the job market, I heard you, I saw you shaking your head a lot to what Alita was saying. Can you share like what, from a candidate perspective, as a student, like how would your approach to the job search be different if the model Alita just laid out were more common?
I think it might take a little bit of pressure off like knowing that like my strengths and my skills were really sort of like considered sort of like holistically. I think as someone going into the job market, in 2020, I think the approach that I want to take is one where I feel like the jobs that I'm applying for and the ways that my skills are represented and the ways that like I am participating in the application process and the hiring process really feel like I am valued as a whole person, and the ways that like my identity factor into that process, and the ways that my skills and experiences and leadership like are really accepted as valid, and I'm blanking on sort of like the term I want to use, but where it feels very authentic, where the hiring process feels very authentic and is really looking at me as a whole person, and I'm looking for communities, workplace communities, workplace environments that are really conducive to that. I mean, I feel like if those practices were incorporated, then we might see more of that, and it might be easier to find those. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you. And that brings up a great point about, when you are interviewing at a company, that is the first way that you get to see what the culture looks like. And we just got a question in the chat about, we talked about hiring and if you're in a management position, but what if you are not in a management position? What are some ways that you can manage up? Or if, anything you might have heard in this conversation so far, you think, yes, that is something that I would love to see in my organization, but I'm not a hiring manager. What would you recommend? What are some next steps?
I guess I have a thought on this. To kind of sum up what Alita and Justin were talking about earlier, and is something that kind of comes up pretty frequently in communicating with prospective students, is transparency and being straightforward and upfront about the situation they're getting themselves into. And that may sound bad, right? But I'm not going to try to sell an experience that doesn't exist, specifically for folks who are from marginalized identities. And the fact of the matter is, especially in business, as I mentioned previously, not all companies are reflective of the general population in the US right now, right? Especially the higher up you get, once you get towards the C-level positions or C-suite, diversity becomes less and less likely, less and less common. The same can be said for institutions of higher education, specifically Ivy, Ivy Plus, Big Ten, right? They are historically white institutions that up until recently, depending on the program or the school you're looking at, haven't necessarily put diversity, equity, and inclusion at the forefront of their recruiting practices, nor at their, in building it up from a structural internal perspective. So in thinking about ways to communicate the importance of this work, even if you're not in a management position, is being transparent. And I understand that in some instances that is dependent on the relationship you have with your supervisor or supervisors and how open and willing they are to have these conversations. But speaking from my own perspective and experience only, I understand everybody's is going to be a little bit different. Being straightforward and upfront with my supervisor in terms of ways that I've felt marginalized or sidelined or disvalued or undervalued, based on instances, right? I'll come to her with examples, and I can't say there have been that many, right? I've had a really positive work experience at UChicago across different departments, but there have been instances where somebody has made a comment without necessarily thinking, or my opinion wasn't necessarily taken with the same weight as somebody else's, right? And there are many reasons that could have been the case, but in my experience, being upfront and transparent about that is going to be really important, because not only do I preach that to the people I talk to, the prospective students that I interact with, and I try to employ that in my own experience as well.
I just really want to plus one that one of the simplest things you can do if you're not in power is to understand what power you do have because of the identities you hold. And one of those identities might be that you've been in the company, and there's power in that because you understand the rules. If you make the implicit explicit, you're helping folks. So here's a really concrete example. In a lot of our organizations, they're small enough that there's no promotion practices in place yet. So we care at Ethos a lot about equitable promotion, especially because we're in the space of work, because we're interested in closing the generational wealth gap that exists across many different marginalized groups. So one of the things that you can do if you're in an organization is to tell people who are coming in from those marginalized groups how folks have gotten promoted in the past, even if it's not pretty, even if it's messy. So one of the things that came up is, unless you were friends with people in the organization that we were supporting, you had no idea how to get promoted, because the only folks who had ever been promoted had close relationships with the founders, and you needed to ask the founders directly. Your own manager didn't actually have promotion power. Well, guess what? No one in the company knew, except for the folks who had been promoted, who really only shared it with people that they were close to. So the first thing you can do is say, what are things that someone coming into this organization would not know that I can make transparent to them? Another thing that you can do is advocate for things that would impact a broader group of people. So we were talking about how bias enters the interviewing process. Something that really minimizes bias is scorecarding. And when folks say culture fit, if they have a scorecard where they have to fill out what those soft skills are, it is harder for them to say someone is not a fit. I also very much believe in advocating for more education and training. We are, at this point in time, a very training-heavy organization. Who says training is not a solution to any problem? It's an initiation into the solution, because that's where you get shared language, that's where you get accountability, and that's where you get people talking about things they wouldn't normally. It's something that you can ask for that's actually pretty low-hanging fruit. And if you are the one who asks for it, you likely have more power than other folks coming into this. And then something I would really encourage you to look at is the bystander intervention techniques that exist today, especially in thinking about what defines somebody's experience within an organization. It's the day-to-day. As much as we want to talk about money, as much as we want to talk about promotion, as much as we want to talk about growth, really, whether your experience is good at a company or not is going to be determined by how you feel talking to people every day. So how do you show up for other people every single day to make their experience better? And in bystander intervention, you have 4 options. They're called the 4 Ds. I add a 4th D that some people don't. I'll explain why. There's direct. That's when you call something out. So somebody makes a microaggressive statement, and in the room you say, hey, that wasn't appropriate. That's not always going to be the best option for you. You may be from that marginalized group yourself. You may be at risk yourself, or you may not have context. You might not understand. Distract is another option, which would be to change the subject and remove that person from harm so that you can later check in on them and see how to proceed forward. Delegate is when you escalate it to a leader, to HR, or, and I think that this is a critically underused tool, you coalition build with your other peers. So you create power by coming together as a group and saying, this is what we want to do differently. As a group, we've decided we're instituting meeting norms, which mean that everybody gets a turn, eliminating interruptions, everybody puts their phones away so that we're not distracted, everybody has role assignments that rotate each meeting, and as a group, we've determined this. Or delay. This is what happens when you weren't there, or you didn't understand what was happening, or you didn't remember. You go to whoever was impacted, and you give options. The hardest question to answer when you have been harmed is, how can I be helpful? So to be able to say, I have 3 options. I can be a listening partner, I can go with you to HR, I can talk to that peer for you. And then having them respond and potentially give you a different option. That's another way to intervene. It's something that at Ethos we call leading without authority. And there are ways to do it. Part of it is tapping into the authority that you do have. And everybody has something. It's just a matter of getting introspective, which is actually a fundamental part of non-racism.
I'm not sure if I have much to add to that. I think that really covered it. I maybe just want to underscore sort of like those sort of like bystander sort of approaches, because I think that's so that really is sort of like allyship, like really like when it comes to sort of like situations where someone doesn't feel like they have the power or the ability to kind of sort of speak out for themselves. It really means the world when someone can step in and sort of make that process easier or make someone feel supported. That really goes a long way.
Great, thank you. One of the other topics that comes up that I think we've been, sort of circling around is this term about like, how do you get the right people to the table? Can you speak about that question and, some of the trade-offs or challenges that might exist in an organization if, I'm a leader and I say diversity and inclusion is important. How do I find the right people to lead this? Who do I ask?
I have a distinct feeling Alita is going to give everybody some really concrete ways to do this, but I will just step in and say, do not underestimate the power of word of mouth and what that carries in marginalized communities, whether it is from if somebody looking for a graduate institution, undergrad institution, or a full-time employment. If you are the only, or there are 5 of you, whatever that may be, rest assured that they have a network built out at other institutions, other organizations, other companies, who they talk to and who they communicate with, who they discuss their experience with. And that could be if you are not supporting this employee, whatever that may look like, right, in that day-to-day Alita was talking about, rest assured, other folks will know that, and it will dissuade them from applying to the job, applying to the institution, applying to the program, right? Again, with the transparency, how do I say this? It is important to be transparent with the employees that you're hiring, to Alita's point, bringing them on board and giving them a full picture of what their experience is going to look like. But know that if those expectations and those promises are not met, that will be communicated to other people in the pool who are thinking about applying to said role, position, institution, and it will ultimately hurt your hiring process and your efforts to make a more inclusive and diverse space.
Yeah, I mean, that is so true. That was true for sort of like my experience coming to UChicago, and I know that's true for like pretty much every instance, especially for marginalized groups. Very much so.
So a few things that I'll add on to that. Word spreads, and there's a gentleman by the name of Daniel Innocent. He's based in New York, and he heads up Veterans Affairs there. And I had the opportunity to interview him about what it means to be a veteran, especially because of the amount of intersections that exist within that social identity group. And one of the things that he was saying is the best way to hire veterans is to hire a veteran, as frustrating as that is, and then give them a good experience, because they are tapped into their communities and they will be able to vouch for you in those communities. It's not turning that person into a token, which I see happen all the time, and putting all of the burden of recruitment on people from those marginalized groups. It's giving them something positive to say when they are participating in their own communities. And the transparency is important in letting people know about transitions and about change. The reality is, look, I'll be totally frank. I trained in anti-racism in particular 3 years ago. I thought it was essential. And I also brought folks onto my team who were versed in healing justice and racial reconciliation, who were coming from the Black and Indigenous communities in particular. because as a white person, I can't speak to that experience. And we couldn't sell it. We couldn't sell it. We couldn't sell it. And then the Monday after the protests around George Floyd started, began my journey of talking to 41 companies in 6 days about anti-racism training. And there was a really major shift, and it was sort of taking a while to wrap my head around it. And one of the things that happened as a result is an extreme increase in skepticism in marginalized communities about folks who were recruiting for them. We had questions that were harder than had been asked in the past. We had people who had had very bad experiences in their current companies around how their companies dealt with the immediate aftermath of this national uprising around violence against the Black community. And so a few things there that I think are just important to keep in mind. Why are you sourcing the way that you're sourcing? How are you doing it differently? Are you building relationships with community organizations that you can put support into beyond just being extractive and asking for their candidates? Are you picking 3 to 5 that you talk to on a regular basis, that you volunteer at their events, that you put dollars behind, that you help thrive? And they don't necessarily have to be recruitment sites. You can work with the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce to support the programs they put in place for Hispanic Illinoisans, right? But the point is, build those relationships, develop your reputation there with your candidates who are coming from marginalized groups, tell them the truth about how things are going, talk to your existing employees about their own experiences, and put your promises out there. Don't make promises you can't keep. It's the worst thing you can do. But look at what promises you can keep. Make sure you're listening to the right people, and the right people are the ones who've been most impacted. That's the place to start. So go ask them what they need and actually listen. Don't try to problem solve in the moment. Remember that urgency is a tenet of white supremacy. Instead, collect information, bring as much of the information together as possible, design solutions. Your own employees will be the ones who will help you in this process as you do the sort of longer term strategy of building relationships with community organizations. And then publicly make those promises and keep them. So a great way of doing that, people are resistant to it. What is your representation today? And what does it look like in 6 months, in 12 months, in 18 months? And be super, super consistent in sharing it so people can see where you are. Trust is about having a confident relationship to the unknown. It's not about being perfect. If you try to come off as perfect, if you try to come off as better than you are, you will alienate the people you're trying to attract.
And I think that's a great lead into the question or the challenge of diversity tax that comes up. I would love to hear, from your perspective of as a leader, how can I listen to the right people, get the right people who are directly affected, as you say, Alita, and also not put all of the burden on the marginalized people in my company.
Here's something really simple. If you ask people to do committee work, pay them, or make sure that they're actually using hours that they would be working. So either reduce their workload when they do that work that they have volunteered for and have said that they wanted to do, not that you invited them to do, that you presented the opportunity to everyone. They said, I raised my hand, I want to do it. And let's say you're on billable hours and you ratchet their utilization rate down to 60% from 75% and say the rest of that time gets allocated here and we'll be accountable to it and it will not impact the way you're evaluated. Or we know that it's going to be 5 hours extra a week and we're just going to pay you 5 hours extra a week. That's one way of not being extractive of, in terms of the diversity tax, of paying more for that labor, which I think is important. I think it's also really important that you create a support system for people who engage in this. Do you create spaces where folks can caucus and talk to each other and process together? If you have more than just onlys within your organization, I think it's really undervalued. There is so much emotional work that goes into anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you are an employee from a marginalized group, you are doing the emotional work of taking care of yourself and other people who are having reactions on your behalf or to you. Is there a resource in place? Is there a community in place? Are you more expansive in your leave policies or your flexible hours with these people? And are there measures for success? One of the things that makes it so frustrating is it takes a long time and it's hard to know if you've done something well. Do you state what those are? Do you source from the broader community of folks who will be impacted what success would look like and use that as a metric? And then my biggest thing is absolutely empower allies to do this work. Just make sure they're trained to do it. There's a lot of white supremacist ideals that enter the DEI process because of who does the work. And if you're an ally who is coming from a space of kindness and care and understanding and has been socialized in, let's say, a racist system or any system, without understanding, without self-awareness, without proper training, you will likely perpetuate some of those ideas. I commit microaggressions, and I've been studying for most of my professional career how not to do it. So imagine saying, I'm going to put together a group of allies who are going to do all of this work. They may not talk to the folks. They may make interpretations. The last thing I'll say on this, I really loved it. Frances Palmer, who is a product designer at one of our client companies, DevRidge, said this about the UX space. Empathy isn't enough. It has to be about solidarity. With empathy, you can create distance, you can interpret, and you can take in information and put it out the way that you see it. With solidarity, everybody is invited to the table to define what is designed. And so think about how that plays out in how you put folks together to design solutions internally.
I think I would definitely second a couple things that Alita said. Don't make the assumption that just because somebody belongs to a marginalized population that they want to do this work. It is not their responsibility to teach you about this work that's happening. Sending out a call to action to everybody in an organization, a community is really important, because not only do you provide marginalized folks the space to step up, you also provide them the space to step back and turn down this opportunity to do this work, which, as Olivia said, is really emotionally draining. I have chosen to go into this work for my professional career, and as a result, I enjoy those opportunities, but I'm me, I'm not everybody else. I'd say the second thing that I was going to kind of second on Alita's, or after what Alita said, was to ensure that there is space to decompress in whatever form that looks like for you from this type of work, because it is very draining. And if you are asking somebody to allocate mental space, emotional space, time and energy for it, they're going to need support in other ways. So it's important to ensure that you provide that for them.
Thank you. And we have an interesting question about how the work environment is changing. This remote work environment is certainly a major change to, people's experience of working together and within a company. Do you think or predict that this remote environment or any other potential changes to work culture and expectations, what kind of impact might that have on the ability to be an ally or an advocate, or what adjustments could or should be made to make you an effective ally in a remote work environment or in some other predicted change of how we experience work?
I mean, I really don't have a lot to say to this, just because I'm not sort of like in sort of like a remote sort of working corporate sort of space. But I will say, like from a student perspective and from sort of like a student leader perspective, what I have found is that like when we're sort of working virtually and we're operating under all this pressure from the pandemic and systemic racism and all of this, using sort of virtual time to check in with your group, however you define it, is really important. And I think not just on sort of like what is being done and what are we working on, what are the next steps, but also the emotional sort of checking in and really sort of making more of an intentional effort to really connect on a more human and a more personal level. And I think that, from my perspective, I think that is how like sort of like our society is changing. I think there's a need perhaps of much more intentionality around sort of like human connection in every aspect of life, from sort of like personal all the way to professional. And I've seen that play out in how we interact virtually, especially.
Thank you. That's a really helpful perspective. And I think certainly this time has shown us that the personal and the professional, as they exist in the same room on the same screen, I think does highlight how carefully those are intertwined, remote or in person. In our last minutes together, I first want to say thank you to all of our panelists, but certainly to all this great conversation that's happening in this chat. I would like to end with, what is one or two things right now that everyone, on this call afterwards can write down and commit to doing, or to taking steps to doing, to promote this, to be an ally or promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workplace?
A conversation we've been having a lot in my role, and the booth community more broadly, is how to acknowledge publicly that you have room to grow. To Alita's point earlier, you're not perfect. You are going to make missteps, and how to become comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable, because there are going to be mistakes you make. There are going to be hard conversations you engage in. There are going to be setbacks in many ways. And so I think, kind of moving forward, both acknowledging that there is space to grow, there are improvements to make, and this work is never done, but also understanding that in doing this work and in moving towards a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable space, culture, whatever that means, where, depending on where you are, is going to be challenging in a lot of ways, and kind of accepting that and doing the work anyway is going to be really important.
I have a similar point to Sana. I'll name my two. So the first is, exposure is the best strategy for change. We are very siloed. We associate with people who are like us. And I see a lot of attempts at exposure that are, again, to use the word extractive, where you suddenly start checking in with folks from that marginalized group, whether it's Asian employees when there's an outburst of xenophobia, or whether it's Black employees after a protest, or whether it's queer employees after a transphobic attack. Ask yourself, what are my opportunities to build bridges with people who are not like me, where I'm getting to know them on a one-to-one individual level, and looking to actually build a relationship, to really build on Justin's earlier point about the importance of human connection. It's been studied since the 40s. I mean, when we look at World War II, it was integrated units where we saw the biggest change in not just racist sentiment, the likelihood of engaging in practices that advanced groups was determined by how much exposure you had. And I would say the biggest challenge for allies today is they're allies to people they don't really know. So how are you getting to know these folks that you want to be allies for on a deeper level, which dovetails into point two, which I think is very much aligned with Sana, which is learn how to apologize. Without equivocation, without qualification, and without fear. Gerald Wing Sue talks about this in Race Talk, but we engage in a conspiracy of silence that reinforces existing power structures. I would rather you make mistakes and then say, I'm sorry, from what I'm hearing from you, what I did that impacted you was X. I will work on not doing that in the future. And that is something that will help you so much as somebody who dove in through the theory first and then went through a lot of painful experiences moving forward. I remember when I was getting my diversity and inclusion certification at Georgetown, and my facilitator said, just apologize. And that honestly was one of the most transformational things anyone had ever said. It was in none of my textbooks. It was in none of my theory. And it has opened up doors and led to conversations that were impossible before.
I don't know how much I can add, because I think all of that is like pretty much it. I think I would just reiterate in sort of my 2 points would be like, one, really focus on like authenticity. I think that's like in that sort of same vein of like human connection. Like we all are human. We are all sort of like trying to like figure things out, and none of us really have the answers. And I think really bringing that reality into the workplace and not sort of trying to put on this facade of like sort of, I don't know, being something you're not, or being an environment that you're not, or I think really sort of tapping into that human element that's going to be messy, that's going to be mistake ridden, that like is full of apologies, that's full of sort of like the complexity of like human experience and identity and emotion and all of that, I think is really important to start like incorporating into like our professional lives. I think that's where we're headed. And I think the more we can intentionally do that, the better. And I think the other thing that I would maybe recommend is, yeah, be committed to the growing process as like sort of you as a professional, or kind of you sort of broadly as a company or as an institution are growing. Like understand like everything that entails. Like growth isn't a linear upward trend. There's going to be sort of like ups, there's going to be downs, and just being committed to sort of like always choosing to do the right thing or trying to make the best decision out with the information that you have. Being like understanding, as people have said, like understanding when you've caused harm and just being willing to like acknowledge that and apologize for that, and really let sort of the person who was harmed sort of dictate how that can be repaired. I think so like authenticity and being committed to the growth process, I think if you sort of focus on those two things, I don't think you can go wrong.
What a great note to end on. I'm seeing, a final question in the Q&A about, what are strategies for follow-up? And it sounds like, from our panelists here, following up is step one, being committed to continuing the conversation as uncomfortable as it might be, and recognizing that that's a growing process. So thank you so much for this conversation. I found it really rich and rewarding, and I hope you did too. We will be sending out a recording and a one-pager from this conversation. So certainly if there are people, colleagues, people in your life, people that you want to continue this conversation with, we will have some resources and additional readings available. So I think that's a good first start. So thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Career Month. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.